Hello and welcome to this Risk.net audiocast Q&A produced in association with TCS, where we're exploring the key challenges of ESG and climate change for financial institutions and the role of climate-adjusted risk-weighted assets and capital, as well as distributed ledger technology. My name's Zoe Fletcher. I'm a contributing editor at Risk.net. I'm delighted to be joined by Alan Smith, Senior Advisor, Climate and ESG Risk at HSBC, and Zeeshan Rashid, Global Head of Climate Change Advisory. Thanks for joining me. Alan, we know that climate change has the potential to destabilize and present systemic risks to global financial markets and the broader economy. Let's start with your view of the disruptive consequences of the systemic risk that climate change poses for financial institutions in particular, and perhaps the opportunities as well.
Thanks, Zoe, and thanks for having the opportunity to be part of what is a really important discussion today. Standing back, I think I would say that the opportunities and the systemic risks are immense. It is not too much of a over-dramatization to say that climate change is the defining strategic opportunity and risk management challenge of our generation in the financial services, but actually beyond that to economies and societies. And those systemic risks actually flow from the two kind of base categories of risks that we do find around climate. The transition risk as we begin to move towards a low carbon economy, and how through regulation and law and consumer preferences that may change business models and render some obsolete or some more relevant, or the physical risks that we just see emerging in terms of how physical ecosystems may become more acute as a result of climate change. The key point is in both of those characterizations and in terms of how the risks are emerging, they can be quite disruptive to the financial system and from a systemic wide perspective. So yes, most definitely climate risk in its manifestations of physical and transition risk are providing, defining challenges as well as strategic opportunities for the sector.
Thanks, Alan. And Zeeshan, what are your views on the threats and opportunities for financial institutions in this context?
Well, if you look at climate change and the risks that it poses and the opportunities as well, a pessimist will say it's an existential threat. An optimist will see it as the biggest opportunity of a lifetime. So it's the way you look at it, and according to me, it's a very big opportunity. The world needs a reset, and I actually see the pandemic as a blessing in disguise. It is telling us how unprepared the world is for a systemic shock, and climate change is multifold bigger in terms of its impact than the pandemic. It brings along a lot of risks because we have seen through the pandemic that the entire ecosystem is like an interwoven fabric. If one piece breaks, it has repercussions across the whole fabric. Similarly, climate change will have that kind of an impact as well. So it will bring tremendous amount of risks to the fore, as Alan mentioned, risks on the physical side as well as on transition side. But it will also bring a lot of opportunities to build a new and sustainable brand, an opportunity to connect with your customers as you have never done before, and an opportunity to build a more profitable firm as well, a profitable and responsible firm.
Thank you, Zeeshan. I think there's quite a strong awareness of the far-reaching implications of climate change, and that's reflected in increasing buy-in around the world to guidance from the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures on governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics. But some are questioning whether climate change has outgrown the ESG mandate and needs unbundling from ESG criteria. Alan, would you agree with this, or do you think that ESG and climate change should continue to be dealt with as one program?
I think I would I would actually challenge that. Climate change is an essential and integrated part of ESG, which in turn is really critical to ensure that firms are sustainable. So how I would look at it is that it's really important for firms to define what they mean by ESG. What comes under the E? Climate is one really big part of it, and the immediacy and urgency of climate change means there should be a lot of focus. But there are other aspects of the E. There's natural capital, there's what is happening with biodiversity, which needs also to be addressed as part of the E of ESG. Under the S, the social side, there are issues of gender diversity, racial justice, kind of skills and skills retooling as we move into a digital age, and then governance builds around how an organization, is accountable, how it drives its governance structures, drives its transparency to the market. I think the key thing is that climate is an integral and high priority part of that, but it needs to be integrated and looked at in a consistent and coordinated whole for it to be effective, because there are interlinkages with all other aspects. So I wouldn't say that it should be kind of decoupled. I think it needs to be integrated, given a lot of resources and high priority. But as we go along, climate and ESG need to be really looked at hand in hand.
Thanks, Alan. And Zishan, how do you view this? How should financial institutions view ESG and climate change? Should they be dealt with as two different programs?
Well, I completely agree with what Alan just said. If you just go back a bit in history, let's say a decade back, ESG was always there. It was a more of a fancy term used to communicate to the world in terms of what the firm is doing towards ESG, but there was no real action following it. Climate, a decade back, was only in the realm of research and academia. Over the last 1.5 years, as we have been through the pandemic, climate is coming mainstream as well. So now when the real action is starting, both on the ESG side, where ESG was more to, as I said, on the fund side, on the asset manager's side, climate is actually integrating more and more to ESG rather than decoupling. And Alan alluded to that climate is a very, very big component of the E part of ESG. And if you see the UN Sustainable Development Goals, around 5 to 6 goals are, focused on climate. In today's world, as I see and what I'm discussing with the leaders in the industry, ESG is normally seen as a revenue earning function for the bank, whereas climate change and climate risk is looked at from a risk management and compliance function for the bank. But it is very important that these two programs are seen as one program, because the data requirements and the final goal of the programs are the same. So to see them together will give a lot of value and a lot of long-term benefits for a firm. Zoe.
Thank you, Zishan. And that's interesting, and it kind of relates back to what you were saying in terms of, really climate change being an opportunity, and so should be seen in the same way as ESG is seen. Would you say that? In terms of you're saying that ESG is seen as a revenue generator, and climate change should be seen in the same way.
I think, Zoe, we need to have a quite thoughtful approach to it. I mean, ESG has gone from being on the margins of being, say, in a corporate social responsibility function of a department and a firm, through being essential to a firm's purpose and strategy. And it needs to be looked at holistically. There are real business opportunities on the climate side in terms of supporting customers in their transition to a low carbon economy, in terms of helping build out climate resilient infrastructure, to help us adapt as we transition to a low carbon world. But on the other side, equally from an ESG perspective, that is now becoming a really important part of of allowing a firm to have a mandate. So, for example, a firm's ESG rating is arguably going to soon become as important as its credit rating that it may get from any of the rating agencies, because people are requiring an ESG rating to whether someone gets on the ability to pitch for a mandate for a bond underwriting or to pitch for certain other kind of other mandates that financial sector firms that might be looking at. So there's real business opportunity in terms of helping customers manage and finance the transition to the low carbon economy, but actually also increasingly ESG is becoming the passport to play. And I think we can't emphasize how important ESG is becoming strategically and in terms of a firm's purpose.
Thank you, Alan. So, as you know, regulators are discussing how climate-related financial risk can be integrated into existing risk management processes, and in particular, if climate risk should be reflected in the risk-weighted capital framework. Alan, do you see climate-adjusted risk-weighted assets and capital becoming a reality soon to make climate adoption mainstream?
If I could answer it slightly differently, if we stand back and think of why we want and hold capital and why we have RWAs, it's to set aside for a risk that we believe that we're taking and that we have to have capital to cover it. And as we described earlier, climate risk is a risk that we need to be thinking about. So there are ways that we must be bringing it into our risk management, how we think about allocation of risks and allocation of our balance sheets, which I think we have to be doing from now. And we have to be doing it in advance of regulators asking us to do it. If we're leading financial institutions and if we believe climate risk is a risk as we do, we need to be then thinking, how do we measure that risk? How do we get the data? How do we understand how those transition and physical risks may materialize and need to be quantified? So most definitely, yes, we have to start that, and we have to start that from now. In terms of when it gets hard-coded into regulatory requirements, I can see that happening within, over the course of the next decade, if not, within the next 5 years. Because the key thing is that if we have a risk, we have to be measuring it, and we ultimately have to be thinking of the way in which we measure capital for it. And so the journey starts now. I don't see it being a reality in a year's time, but you can see that journey happening and being prescribed with increased, firmness and formality, definitely within the next 5 years.
Right. So what you're saying is, first we need to start with looking at how to measure the risk and quantifying it, and then it'll be sort of a fairly slow road to getting to that point.
I wouldn't say a slow road. What I was saying is that as of today, all of us believe this is a risk that we have to face. And if it's a risk which we're facing, we have to start measuring it so we can monitor and manage it and mitigate it. And that journey starts and should already have started. And in identifying those risks, and as we start to manage them, that will give us a sense of the amount of capital that we'll be needing to allocate towards it. And I think that journey needs to start now and in advance of any prescription of what a regulator may ultimately and almost certainly bring into the regulatory capital system. But I think the important thing is that us as an industry, having identified climate risk as a risk that we face, that we are starting from now to begin to think about how we quantify what that risk is in all its aspects, in its capital kind of measurement perspective, in its ECL perspective, in its ultimate stress exposure perspective, that the frameworks for measuring that should be starting to be built from now.
Great, thanks for clarifying, Alan. And Zishan, do you have an idea of how soon you think that climate risk might be reflected in a risk-weighted capital framework?
Every important program which has an impact as big as climate change goes through a journey, through a maturity journey, right? And we are at the very beginning of the journey. At this point of time, still there is no global consensus in terms of the data, the actual calculation of the physical risks, emissions, as well as transition risk, and as well as on the disclosures. So we are all in the very start of the journey trying to figure out how to, get to a consensus on all of that. So that's number one. And the big problem here is because since there is no historical data available, no accurate models can be built. So that's where we are relying so much on scenario analysis. Some of our regulators, some of the regulatory bodies globally are calling to take the output from the scenario analysis and incorporate that into the risk models to understand the impact on the various business lines, balance sheet, and so on and so forth. And based on that, they can set capital aside as a part of the Pillar 2 ICAP for banks and ORSA for insurance firms. So that is the first step, which I probably see is easy. Now, for the regulators to build the climate factors and the climate requirements as a part of the RWA and capital is going to take time. They also need some data in terms of analyzing the sensitivities and the non-linearities between the physical risks, transition risks and the mainstream risks. So while that work we believe will be going on as we talk now, it's going to take some time for them to assess some data on which they can prescribe in terms of what impact it will have on the capital and RWA and all the sensitivities of various assets to be converting them into a regulation. So I completely agree with Alan that it is definitely going to happen, but it is going to take some time because the regulators also need some proper data on which to base their decisions on.
Fantastic, thank you. So next, I wanted to talk to you about distributed ledger technology. We know that climate change will demand global coordination and collaboration, and that DLT has an important role to play in the calculation of physical and transition risks. So, Alan, how are financial institutions using DLT in dealing with the double counting issue in emission scopes 1, 2, and 3?
So if I stand right back, I think even before looking at how firms are using it now, and again, this is actually at a concept innovation stage, rather than people using it to the best of my knowledge. But it's a very powerful and essential aspect of innovation, which I think we need to consider. Climate risk is the ultimate big data area, whether it's measuring emissions, scope 1, 2, or 3, whether it's measuring geospatial information in the context of physical risks. And it's really challenging us to come up with robust techniques, technologies, which will allow us to do that in an effective way. And DLT is one really very powerful potential solution. It addresses the issue of double counting, which is one of the risks. It also allows us to begin to get a lot of the kind of interlinked supply chain information around climate risk, which is also another key thing that we'll need to address. So I think potentially and conceptually, this is a really, really important piece of innovation that's emerging, which could be extremely valuable because we have some really big data and measurement challenges to sort, and I think DLT is one of the areas that can help us do that.
Great, thank you, Alan. And if I could ask you the same, Zeeshan, how do you see financial institutions using DLT in dealing with the double counting issue in emissions, scopes 1, 2, and 3, or other risks, perhaps in terms of physical and transition risks posed by climate change?
If you look at DLT, it's a very powerful concept, and I think nobody can debate that. Everybody agrees to that DLT is a very sound and powerful concept. However, in terms of the real usage of DLT in the mainstream, if you see, there are far and few. From the success perspective, if you look at the KYC and the trade finance are two areas where DLT is being used. Of course, crypto is a very big area, but we'll keep that aside for the moment. DLT is in some lighter vein is also talked about as a hammer looking for a nail. And I believe that climate change can be one of the very important use cases from a DLT perspective. There are 2-3 reasons for that. Number one is data. As I was telling you earlier as well, data is going to be a very important factor in climate change, the quality of data, the volume of data, and the size of data. This kind of data has never been sourced, managed, or monitored ever before, right? And to manage this data, DLT can play a very important role. So that's number one. Number two is the sharing of data. Keeping the mandates of privacy in mind, DLT can also bring that platform on which curated data can be shared with the participants. So it is a data which is of good quality, which can be used for the participants for their climate risk estimation. Number three is on the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, where there is a lot of debate, a lot of research going on globally, especially on how to identify, measure, and manage the scope 3 emissions. And when you look at scope 1 and scope 2, 3 emissions, it's a very difficult area to manage and identify as well, because there is a lot of overlap. What is scope 1 for a firm will become scope 2 for the other, can become scope 3 for the third firm, and vice versa. There is a lot of interconnectedness within firms, within an industry, within a nation, and cross industry as well, because in today's world we have global supply chains. And it's very difficult to identify the demarcation of scope 1 and scope 2 and scope 3. To be able to identify the carbon price, carbon tax, carbon invoice, which each firm has to disclose as a part of their regulatory disclosures. So I believe that DLT can be a very good tool or a platform on which this data can be managed from a scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 emissions. And with the right approach and the right algorithms that we can build on that, the problem of double counting can be eliminated. So it's not just at the firm level, but at a national level, the government and the central bank can assess the carbon footprint of the country, and where supply chains cross boundaries, then at a global level as well, the scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions can accurately be calculated, and hence the pricing of carbon and the carbon taxation and the carbon invoice can be properly allocated or apportioned to the right firm in the right order. Zoe.
Thank you. Finally, having discussed many aspects of climate risk and the impact on financial institutions, Alan, what would be your call to action for the industry?
I think to have a sense of urgency and purpose around it, that quite genuinely this decade is going to be game determining in whether we get to a net zero world by 2050. The actions that we have to take in reshaping risk appetite, in beginning to engage with our customers to transition to a net zero world, so we're beginning to have to measure temperature alignment. I would say to let people have an understanding that there's a need for urgency and purpose, and that to view the year 2050 not as being 30 years into the future, but actually the most important and immediate date that we need to have in our strategic and operational planning. And that's the kind of message that I would give.
Thanks, Alan. And Zeeshan, would you agree with that 2050 date? Should that be foremost in the minds of financial institutions? What would your call to action be for the industry?
For me, 2050 is a long way away. We need to take action now. It is not an event which is a probability. It's not a probable event. Climate change is here and now. It's a certainty. Every day of an inaction will cost us. Every day of inaction is a lost opportunity as well. So there is a need for an urgent, coordinated, and collaborative action globally. Pandemic has been a great divider. It is taking countries, societies, people apart. Climate change, I believe, is the biggest unification factor that the world has seen in recent times. It should bring everybody together because in this fight, in this journey, nobody can win on its own. We have to win it together or we lose it altogether. So we need to believe in that and work together to make this success and make a better future for all of us.
Thank you, Zeeshan. Thanks both of you for sharing your thoughts on this. It's been very inspiring. This audio cast was brought to you by Risk.net in association with TCS. Goodbye for now, and we hope you found it useful.